So it's modeling energy in the environment because this is still the first session, the second part of it. But now we're going to relate much more to E3-India in particular and the way the modeling is done. So bear in mind the ways the different models work. And if there are any questions about how this compares to the other modeling approaches that were presented, of course, happy to discuss that. But yeah, this session, so this is about the energy side. The economics will come tomorrow. You talk about the basic model structure, so how energy demand is estimated, how it links to the economic parts of the model, and the various feedbacks. The accounting framework, again, that's just the links to the energy side and the modeling of it. And then I'm going to talk about the power sector model in quite some detail, as that's very much separate to the econometric part. And I think there's an example towards the end. Okay, very basic introduction to E3-India model. I would hope that much of this you're already on top of, having seen the packs. So what is the model? The model is a computer-based tool that you've all downloaded already. It's designed to look at policies. They don't have to be energy policies, but it's definitely one of the areas of strength of the model. It splits up to 32 states and territories, combines an accounting framework with a set of behavioral equations to give a simulation of the economy and the energy system as a whole. And it's projecting out forwards to 2035 on an annual basis, so results for each year in that period, and you can get some nice line charts coming out of that, as you saw at the start of the day. The background to the model. This is something we've been asked a few times. Why are you doing all of this? It's a very good question. And here we have to thank the Regulatory Assistance Project, Rap and Surubi and her colleagues here, who really set all of this in motion. So what RAP found in their discussions with policymakers were, well, first of all, a lot of the policy in India is determined at state level. There are lots of ideas out there for policies, both in renewables, in energy efficiency, and in other areas as well. But there was a big barrier to any of these policies being implemented because the policymakers didn't know the scale of the impacts that can be made. That comes right back to the introduction I was giving. What order of magnitude is the effect on jobs and GDP and incomes and all the rest? So the question was, can we provide that sort of information to fill that gap? And a modeling approach is starting to give some numbers on it, as I mentioned earlier, not necessarily to the third decimal place or anything like that, but order of magnitude at least, to see, is this going to cost a lot of jobs in my state? So that was the idea. Let's build a model to address these issues. Of course, lots of challenges have come up along the way. Talk about many of them. You'll probably ask questions about the others. Data, I'm sure, will come up before too long. But where we got to is now we have this tool available, which is what you have downloaded, to look at policies. It's been developed from the E3-ME global model, so it's the same structure, the same underlying theory, and the same way that the economy and energy system works. But each of the 32 states and territories is broken down to 20 sectors, and we can have a talk about those sectors later on. But everything happening at as detailed a level as the data will allow, and some people would say beyond that as well. Yes, a collaborative effort. How does it all, how the relationship between Cambridge Econometrics and researchers in India work. There's a picture of King's College in Cambridge there on a sunny day. So definitely was not looking like that when I left 2 weeks ago and it was snowing. That's much more like the weather in India, which I appreciate much more. Cambridge Econometrics, okay, based in Cambridge, not that far away from King's College. So we've developed the initial version of the tool that's now available. There's already been quite a bit of interaction with gathering the data and fitting it together and understanding the India context more specifically. We're very much aware of the limitations that we have in terms of our understanding of the context of how things work within India. We're providing the numbers, we're providing the accounting framework, we're providing the econometrics, but when it comes to institutions and the sorts of policies that are being discussed, this is well beyond our knowledge. We're not going to claim any knowledge or capabilities there. So you see the two arrows on the diagram. I think it's very simple, meant to represent the two-way interaction. Now that the model's available, I think these two arrows are really crucial for making the whole thing work, because we'll continue to provide support, continue to update the data in the model, but we're not really in a position to design scenarios and understand the policy situation, and that requires people like you guys, researchers here in India, to basically take the tool that's there and start to use it. Really part of the aim of this course is to generate the enthusiasm amongst you people to build this into your own research and start to look at things that are useful to policymakers, useful to your own studies. And that's the idea. I do want to emphasize the last point as well. There are, of course, other modeling exercises going on in India. There's a lot of good work being done, and we're definitely not trying to replace any of that. What we're doing here is complementary. Complementary in, I think, two main ways. Having all the states there within a single modeling framework. We've not seen other examples of that. And you can get to the national totals by adding the states together as well. And then the second thing, the underlying economics, the Keynesian approach, which is quite different to the CGE models that are being used. As I'll talk much more about that in the session tomorrow morning. The idea, if we can stimulate interest in the model, but definitely not trying to displace other efforts that are going on. Now, before getting really deep into the energy stuff, the basic features, which I think you need to know to understand the context of the energy modeling, these 6 boxes that we have been through many times in the past 2 weeks to describe the model. Some of them I think I've already spoken about in the opening session. So the detailed coverage, of course, the states and territories and the sectors. When it comes to the energy system, we don't have 20 sectors, we only have 8. Again, the reason is just the data here. We've taken as much information as we can, but it doesn't go to the same level of detail. But having said that, many of the 20 economic sectors are services sectors that don't use large amounts of energy. So I don't think we're losing too much. And the 5 different energy carriers, or fuels, as they're sometimes called, coal, oil, gas, biomass, and electricity. Again, if we could get more data on that in future, we could disaggregate a bit further, but just those 5 types at the moment. Okay, comprehensive. This refers to both the economic system and the energy system, covering all the sectors. You add those sectors up together, you get to the total, so GDP in economic terms, total energy consumption in the energy system, and total emissions when talking about carbon dioxide emissions, getting towards greenhouse gas emissions as well. Highly empirical. 16 sets of econometric equations. That doesn't sound like much, but each set is disaggregated by state and by sector as well. So 16 times 32 times 20, roughly that many equations in the model. The accounting identities, okay, they're given by the framework of national accounts. Talk about that tomorrow. And the other dimension, of course, is time. The database 1993 up to 2012 is actually currently 2016 because we've been updating the data recently. Bottom row, consistency. Now this is between the energy system and the economy. It's all, the model is a single framework. It gives results for the economy, it gives results for energy. Of course, they have to be consistent with each other. That's part of what the model does, is enforce that they are consistent. Forward-looking out to 2035, I've talked about, and then the modules, and that's quite important because here I'm going, in the rest of this presentation, talking about the energy module. That links to the economy, and that links to the environment module, which is mainly emissions. But the idea is you can substitute bits in and out if you want to link to other models that are more detailed. Yeah, so if you want to see what the 20 sectors are and what the 8 energy using sectors are, then yeah. And again, when thinking about scenarios that you might want to look at, this is the option you've got available. Really, these the different breakdowns, and the same with the results that come out of the model. Yep, you're right. I skipped over that. It's more on the economics and the energy system, so I was going to keep that till tomorrow. But in summary, accounting identities are things like GDP should be the sum of the components of GDP. So there are equations that don't have a behavioral element to them. These are equations that it doesn't matter what kind of economic model you use, they'll be the same in each model. So they're generally considered as non-controversial. Okay, are there any other questions before I dive into this slide? Okay. Yeah, carrying on with the features of the model, just in a little bit more depth than the previous boxes. These are, yeah, in many ways, I think each of these 4 terms is sort of an economic buzzword, a piece of terminology that sometimes gets thrown around. So the model is structural. That means it has this detailed sectoral disaggregation as far as we can go with the data. And we have the links between the different sectors through the input-output tables that tell us how what they're all buying from each other. Social accounting matrix, of course, incorporates that, plus a bit more on the final demands as well. You piece together the different bits of the model, you can get to a single matrix for that. Okay, dynamic, another term that's often thrown around in modeling, meaning different things to different people. What I mean by saying that E3-India is dynamic, it's path dependent. What happens in one year affects future years. And I think in the example you saw with renewables earlier, this is quite important because you put a lot of investment into renewables early on in the projection period. They become established in the market and you carry on going down that road. So even a small change quite early on can lead to quite big differences in the end. The time series data, yes, talked about that already. But the key point I think here is that each equation is estimated by state and by sector. So it's taking into account the specific characteristics of that sector in that state. So we're not imposing the same behavior across all the different parts of India. It is separate to where you are. Yeah, there's a section in the manual on the data sources with quite a big table for each of the indicators. I think what we don't have in the manual is how much of it's actual data and how much is gaps that have needed to be filled out, partly because we haven't really found a good way of documenting that yet. But I mean, more generally on the data, of course, we're not going to claim it's anywhere near perfect at the moment. And really, if any of you are coming across issues in the data or things that don't look right or things that could be improved upon, by all means, point it out, because we've been working with we've reviewed all the data we could find, but I'm sure there are many more things out there that we haven't got to yet. Okay, just finishing down this slide. Your features of the model. The middle one, scenario approach, are reasonably obvious. So when we're running the model, we have a baseline set of projections, so business as usual, based on existing policy. We then put in the policy and run it again, and the difference between the two sets of outputs is the policy impacts. The top, I'll skip over the top point because that's about the economics, which we'll come back to tomorrow. And uncertainty, so I said there's lots of sources of uncertainty in the model. And there's two types of uncertainty here. First of all, the agents in the model, when they make decisions, they can't predict the future, so they don't have full information. They're subject to uncertainty. But then there's also the uncertainty around the model itself and all the inputs to it and the results from it. When I talk about the energy sector, hoping you will all be thinking about the sorts of scenarios you might want to look at later on. So these are the inputs to the model. It's policies. Some examples there, the sorts of policies that can go in. Carbon and energy prices, taxes, emission trading systems, quite standard stuff for a macroeconomic model because it's an economic instrument, so you're very well suited to look at that. But then also incentives for renewables, including policies such as feed-in tariffs or other types of technology subsidies that are there. And the one that's often forgotten about, energy efficiency and regulation more broadly. Think about ideas for potential policies that fall into any of those categories. Leaving aside the policy side of things, just shocks, oil price shocks, what's happening in the rest of the world outside the scope of the model. That's some potential for scenarios as well. And then the last point, in case any of you here really don't care about energy and emissions at all, you can just stick to the economics part of it and look at, say, fiscal shocks, changes in monetary policy, things like that. So quite a lot of potential there, and so it's really up to you guys and your ideas. Okay, and the outputs, these are not energy outputs, but there's still things that you might want to look at from the energy policies. So GDP, of course, number one indicator for many policymakers, but also the breakdown by sector, of course, by state as well. The other economic indicators coming from the national accounts, talk more about that tomorrow, but you could see, so consumption and incomes, again, quite important for policymakers, looking more on the social aspects. And then jobs, yes. We're often told, just tell me how many jobs. So we've got the labour market stuff up there. And yeah, whatever policy you put into the model, what comes out for jobs is probably going to be quite important for the policymakers. And on the energy side, quite a wide range of results. So energy balances, both by the sectors that are consuming energy and also by the fuel types that are being used, including any fuel switching activities. Energy prices, again, coming back to the social aspects of things. What are the impacts on low-income households, the impacts on rural households, which can be quite different from the more aggregate results. So quite an important set of information there. And finally, on the environmental side, the emissions levels coming out of the model. Now, starting to get into the details within the model. Here's quite a high-level picture, then we'll work our way down, gradually getting more detailed. So, remember I briefly mentioned modules, and yeah. Yeah.
Does it give you changes in the exchange rate? Supposing there's an oil price shock,
Mm-hmm.
there would be most likely some changes in the exchange rate accordingly to the. Does the model work without
Yeah, it's a very good question. What is exogenous and what is endogenous? In fact, the current version of the model, the one that you all have, we changed it recently. So it is now, there will be a change in the exchange rate in response, and there will be a change in interest rates in response, as there are equations that determine these aspects. How big they are depends on the size of the shock, I guess. But there is a response. Yeah, that's right. In terms of other policy, it's more fixed. So fiscal policy, there's no endogenous response at the moment. Okay, good. Right, so here's the three modules, the sort of highest level schematic of the model that we have. We got three modules: economy on the left, energy on the right, emissions at the top. Each one of those starts with the letter E, hence gives the name E3-India, because it brings these three modules together inside a single framework. What to take from each box? Okay, first of all, you see we give the units in each box. Economy, it's in monetary units. Energy, it's in a physical measure of energy, tons of oil equivalent. And emissions, it's a physical unit, tons, or tons of CO2 equivalent. Thinking right back to the beginning of the first presentation of cost-benefit analysis against impact analysis, you see here everything is in its own units, so we're very much talking about impact analysis. If you want to then convert everything to money terms, there's nothing to stop you from doing that, but you can choose the monetary value of a ton of CO2, for example, and the model doesn't make assumptions about that.
In your earlier presentation, you had a sort of overall conceptual framework where economy was in the center of technology.
Yes, true. Economy is linked to everything else in the model. Yeah, technology wasn't on the previous one at all. Probably because the sustainable development indicators that those boxes were taken from, nobody has decided how to measure technology yet, would be my guess. But yeah, I think that's a really good point about how different people look at the system.
are those sort of like the broad basis for measuring these things? Because environment is more than emissions, right? So
Mm.
does it
Yeah, I completely agree. And we say it's an energy environment economy model, but usually by environment we do just mean emissions at the moment. No, that's where we are now. I think there's a lot of scope in the future to bring in, so certainly water consumption, material consumption. So we already have local air pollutants as well, so it's not just greenhouse gas emissions. Air quality could come into it in a lot more detail. There's no theoretical reason these things can't be done. It's just A, maybe data, and B, we haven't got to it yet. But I think it would be good for us to know as well what the priorities are, say from a policy perspective and a development perspective, so that we can focus in future developments if we're bringing these things in as well. But what I certainly don't want to give the impression of is that these are the only things that are important and things that aren't in the model don't matter, which sometimes unfortunately does happen because nowadays there's such an obsession with numbers. If you don't have numbers on it, then it gets forgotten about. And biodiversity in particular really suffers, I think, from this because it's very difficult to quantify. But basically I agree with your point there. Okay, what I wanted to talk about on this slide in particular is the arrows going between the different components, because this is the core strength of the model, holding everything together within a single framework. Probably the most important of those arrows are the two at the bottom, the links from economy to energy and vice versa. So I'll talk about these links in more detail in the next few slides, but in general, just to give an overview, the blue line going from economy to energy system, if the economy is growing faster, there'll be a bigger demand for energy and more energy consumed. That's a fairly straightforward relationship. The red line coming back, well, if we're consuming more energy, that's good for the electricity sector, the extraction sectors, maybe refineries as well. Those are economic sectors in their own right, so there's a feedback there because that part of the economy is doing better if more energy is consumed. What the model does is it's taking these feedbacks in both directions and coming back to this word consistent, making sure that the economy and the energy system are moving in step. Those are all sort of real terms relationships. Of course, there's prices as well going each way. What's going on in the economy in terms of prices, inflation rates, feeding into the energy system, which is then giving you energy prices back again. So we've got two layers to this relationship, the physical, real-term stuff and the prices as well. Now, looking up to the top to emissions, going from energy to emissions, that's a more straightforward approach. It's just based on coefficients. You consume X amount of coal, you get Y amount of emissions from coal just by multiplying two numbers together, and that's more straightforward. And to complete the loop, the yellow arrow coming down back to the economy, that's all talking about policies here. So carbon taxes or energy taxes, trading schemes, or even regulations that mean that the level of emissions influence what happens in the economy. Okay, let's get to the box in the middle, technology. Very conspicuous there, and coloured green, more in hope than anything that the technology that's developed will be green rather than consuming more energy. Two-way arrows between technology and the economy, and the technology and the energy system. So, question again always comes up: how do we model technology? Well, it's actually different between the links. For the economy, technology is determined by investment levels. As I mentioned in the first presentation, we can't work out what all the different technologies are in all the different sectors. That would be an impossibly large task. So we use investment in R&D basically as a proxy for technology. In the energy system, there's a bit of that too, but also a lot of detail in the electricity sector where we define the different potential generation methods that can be used. And that gives us a lot more detail that we can work with and a lot more options for policies as well. And I have about 10 slides on that.
I have a few questions.
Of course, yeah.
So the environmental taxes and energy use prices and taxes,
Mm.
what they do different? So if environmental tax is because of energy use, so I mean, where's the difference between these two types of taxes?
Sorry, between energy and carbon tax, do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, so it's kind of an implicit carbon tax. Appears to
Mm.
be kind of an implicit carbon tax, any tax on say.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They're very similar. I guess there's two differences. First of all, just the rates that are used. The carbon tax will hit coal a lot more heavily than gas, for example. But if you set an energy tax where the rate for gas was half the rate for coal, then you'd effectively have a carbon tax. The only other difference is the carbon emissions that come from non-energy uses, so part of the industrial process, like steel, chemicals, cement, which is it's not a big part of emissions, but it is important to those sectors. But yeah, otherwise it's the same mechanisms being used. You're right.
Actually, I thought that this link the emissions to economy would be because of the emissions, what's the damage, and then that comes into it. Difficult to quantify.
Yeah, okay. So
Because the other one is
I think it should be clear, we don't have any of these damage estimates feeding back automatically. Again, this is something that if you want to put in your own numbers, then it's not that difficult to do it. But just by assumption at the moment, because we just don't know these values, we haven't put anything in. Right, getting into the details of the energy model. What does it do? Well, okay, it estimates energy consumption and it estimates energy prices. It takes inputs from the economic part of the model and it gives the feedbacks back as on the previous slide. Yeah, coming back to the terminology, top down. This is top down in the energy sense of the word. So E3-India, it's econometric equations for all of final demands. And then we just have the bottom up, more engineering focused treatment for the power sector. Yeah, and it says road transport, that's not in the current model version, but it might be in future. Okay, so a schematic of how it all works. Sorry that the yellow box on the right-hand side doesn't come out very well. So we've got the economy at the bottom and the environment bit at the top, and then these are the energy module relationships in the middle. We start off with, really from here, from this point, with the economy giving the demands for energy consumption. It's a secondary energy demand. Think of that as final energy demand, basically, which is consumption for heating purposes, consumption for transport, mainly. But it doesn't include the power sector or refineries. So the first stage is to estimate energy consumption in each sector. And moving across that horizontal arrow into the middle, the second stage then is to say, well, this is energy consumption, which fuels are being used to meet that energy consumption, and this is where it's split between the five, so coal, oil, gas, biomass, electricity as well. It couldn't all fit in the box. And put those two things together, moving across to the right again, you get fuel use by fuel user, which is essentially the energy balances by sector. There is a stage to scale it to make everything add up to the total as well, again, just for consistency. Again, going right to the right-hand side, the yellow box, I don't know if you can read that at all, but it says air emissions, so greenhouse gas, and also local air pollutants as well that are linked to fuel consumption. And then that feeds up to the environment in terms of total emissions that are there. The green arrows downwards are more aspirational at the moment. They're not built into the model, and we don't have, say, the damages that were already mentioned, but also the feedbacks from a changing climate or anything like that. Again, just because we don't know what those links are, but it certainly is possible to put these in as part of a scenario design if you want to do that. And the one thing I haven't mentioned on this slide is this second box from the right, price for fuel use. Again, just to say that while we have the quantities going through this system, we also have the prices as well, which are determined by a combination of international commodity prices, but also domestic taxes, and in the case of electricity, the choice of generation and the mix of generation that's being used. Yeah.
From secondary energy demand to fuel used by user, there are two different paths. One is the straight horizontal path, another is the upward cross.
That's right. So the straight arrows are referring to quantity relationships, and the curved arrows are to do with the prices. So this this curved arrow going across the top that says weights next to it, which is a bit cryptic in nature. It's saying when we're doing the econometric estimation, we have price variables in there. And at least for total energy consumption, the price that's used is a weighted average of the fuels that are used. And basically what that's saying is the weights are given by the consumption of each fuel, which then feeds back to the price term at the bottom. Probably should make that arrow a different color or something to differentiate it. The international commodity prices are exogenous, they're given, but then, the tax rates are exogenous as well, but everything else is endogenous. We have to have a prediction for. Yeah, absolutely. This is a question about sort of baseline projections, and the energy prices is one of the most uncertain things in those projections. I fully agree. And in fact, it's out of all the sensitivity analysis that's done with these sorts of models, changing the fuel prices is probably the one that is done the most by quite some distance. So usually in our work, we don't try to predict energy prices. We take, say, IEA projections from World Energy Outlook publication, and we just plug that into the model and say, well, okay, the IEA, what these guys do is predict energy prices. They know a lot more about it than we do. So we'll just follow their assumptions and take it as given. But yeah, if you change the baseline prices, you can get quite different results coming out.
Other than the emission, there is no feedback to the economy. Yes, you just have the price is endogenous here. So exogenous, there will be feedback to the economy also.
You're right, that's missing from this slide, and the reason for it is the feedbacks are on a different slide. So there's a separate slide that shows all the feedbacks in a bit more detail than this would. But yeah, I'll come on to that in a minute. Okay, one step deeper, the econometric equations for energy demand. So, first of all, taking the equation for total energy consumption, it's an econometric equation where energy consumption is a function of economic activity rates, prices. Now, this is prices being weighted average of the different types of fuels, as was just asked, in relation to the price level for the economy as a whole, so relative prices of energy. And a measure of technology, which is basically saying that's the quality or efficiency of the capital stock that's being used. We have restrictions on the directions of these relationships. So more economic production leads to higher energy consumption. Higher energy prices lead to lower energy consumption. And a more advanced technology system leads to less energy consumption. This is always all other things being equal. I'll just move it on one slide and then we can look at the equations in a bit more detail. Because if the last slide was the total energy demand, this is now looking at the different fuels. So there's 4 different equations here, equation sets for each of the 4 main fuel types. And the structure of these...
One of these is then computed from the aggregate demand, or
No, these are done separately, first of all. So the total is estimated first, and then these are estimated separately through a similar set of econometric equations. The only difference being the price term here is the price of that one fuel. And so we'll get 5 different numbers coming out. The total, the results for these 4 different fuel types, and an assumption about what biomass is held as a fixed share. And then the last point is, I think, getting to your question that how's it all made consistent, and it's just a scaling process to make sure that the fuels add up to the total. We've got a formal representation of all the equations. This is not in the manual document, but it is in a separate document that you all got when downloading the model. So I think you all have this, yeah? I just wanted to just put this up, partly just to reiterate what I just said, but also to give an example how this is represented in the document, so you can refer to it for other equations as well. So in this document, we have a formal representation of most of the accounting equations in the model, but also the behavioral, the econometric equations in there too. And at the moment, we're talking about some of the econometric ones, and see here, sets 2 to 6 are energy demand given. So all it's saying here is we've got these 5 sets. FR0 is the model code for total energy consumption, and then the other ones, FRCT, ET, GT, and OT, that's the different fuel types: coal, electricity, gas, and oil. So using the acronyms. Unfortunately, the model software means that the variables are only allowed to have 4 names, 4 letters, so they all have to be quite short. But what it means is F is for fuel, which is the first fuel user, the first dimension. R is for region, just state, territory, and then the other ones followed. So what it's saying here is, for the first one, FR0 equals function of FRY, PREN, FRK. That's in that document. You can get a lot more information about what each of these things are in the manual, in the section on equations, if you haven't found it already. But it will tell you that all of these things are, so FR0 is total energy consumption by the 8 different fuel-using sectors and the 32 states. That is a function of FRY, which is economic production, but converted from the 20 economic sectors to the 8 energy sectors, which is just a matrix translation and aggregation. This PREN, which is the energy price of energy, which is the weighted average of the different fuel types divided by the consumer price deflator to give you a relative measure. And then also this term FRK, which is investment, again converted to the 8 fuel-using sectors to give you a measure of efficiency of the capital stock that's in that. And then the same for the 4 individual fuel equations, which I think are all in one table in the manual that you can see.
These correlations are derived from what kind of time horizon?
So the estimation is time series based on the historical data we have, which is 1993 to 2016 in the current version.
That's for the whole country or state?
That's state by state, yeah. So it's
Because, you know, you did this long term, or you just like 11 to 16 as there will be a change.
yeah.
This is the biggest problem.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's an econometric model, so it's dependent on the data. We definitely can't escape that. Yeah, I mean in general, there's a we follow the rule of thumb that you project forward with as far as you go back in the data, which there is no formal justification for this, but it's what a lot of the econometricians do. So by going to 2035, we're roughly in line with that. But yeah, well, I think probably just best to say we're looking forward to having longer time series to work with, because there are other things that we would like to put in these equations as well, like.
So suppose someone replaces these equations, what they give, that someone is working on, some researcher is working on it and link it up with your model, or we need to ask you and then
Yeah, I think for that kind of thing, it's best just get in touch and see, because in some cases it probably is possible, in some cases it would be difficult. But we're certainly happy to explore various ways to do that, because we still haven't had a chance yet to really test lots of different things in the equations. And yeah, as we get more data, I would expect more terms to be added to these equations.
any of the students who use it, they'll only be able to use it for their work if they are able to modify things like this. So it will not make sense for them to just plug in numbers and get something.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and we think we need to work out the ways to do that. Yeah, I agree. The reason is just the size of the model means that we need to keep a relatively fixed structure. So to keep it manageable, each of these equation sets, which are then disaggregated by sector and state, we need to have the same terms in each equation, which leads to quite a fixed structure. Now, of course, the numbers vary by state, but the actual the structure of the thing is more difficult to modify. But yeah, having said that, there's nothing to stop anybody taking the data, going to eViews or Stata, and starting to look at adding new terms in, and then certainly happy to explore the options for the possibilities. But yeah, we're very much aware of the limited degrees of freedom that we have with the time series here. Right, okay. Are there any questions about this document and how the equations appear in the manual at this point? And I'm sure we're going to come back to it later on as well. Yeah, the two documents are for different purposes, really. The manual has, I think, all the detail in it, but it means it's, well, 150 pages long. Whereas this document is meant to be more of a quick lookup, I think, that has all the equations together. Okay. Are we due to finish at 1 o'clock this session? Yeah, okay. So I'll talk about the feedbacks, and then I'm going to talk about the power sector model, and we'll probably break for lunch at that point. But we'll see how we go. This is the diagram that links back to the economy, the one that was missing from the other flow chart, just showing how we get back to economy from the energy sector. I appreciate we haven't introduced the economy yet, so this isn't the most straightforward to interpret. But essentially, the thinking is we've got two different measures of the same thing quite often. So take the first example, consumers' expenditures on fuel and petrol. We've got that in energy terms from the energy equations, but we've also got it in economic terms from the accounting data. And basically what the model is doing is it's changing the economic value to be consistent with the energy value. So if the energy equations are saying that households use 10% more fuel for vehicles, then that economic number will be increased by 10% as well, all in real terms. So that's for the households. For industry, we've got a similar thing, except we're talking about intermediate demand, which is a point in the input-output table, which I'll talk about a bit more tomorrow, but the same principles. Okay, then for electricity, again, it's quite similar. Electricity is an economic sector in the model, but also know it is an energy sector that both consumes fuels, but produces electricity for the other sectors, so different stage in the process. But again, the economic numbers are being modified to be consistent. And then finally, but certainly not least important, the prices coming through, which you talked about already in the discussion. But the one where we see the most change is the electricity prices, because that depends on the generation methods that are being used. And that leads quite nicely into the next few slides on the power sector modeling. Okay. Right, now, I have to say, first of all, this was not built by me, this tool, so I'm presenting somebody else's work, my colleague, JF, Jean-Francois Mercure, who was based at the University of Cambridge at the time he did this. You'll see in a minute the slides will change from having the Cambridge Econometrics logo to the University of Cambridge logo. That's the reason why. But he's built this model of the power sector of electricity capacity, electricity generation, and feeding back to fuel prices and investment. It's called FTT, which stands for Future Technology Transitions. The framework is applied, it can be applied to the electricity sector. In our global model, we now have it applied to the cars and also household heating, which again, these are things that could be integrated to E3-India in future. But it's a model of technology diffusion, so the take-up of the technologies that are out there. It's considered from an investor's perspective and from a quite micro perspective. So the first slide shows how it links together with the different modules. Thinking back to the slide with the brightly coloured boxes, we've got the same economy, energy and environment around the side, although rotated slightly. But instead of having technology in the middle, we've got a box saying FTT power, because this is what the model is doing, is determining the technology choices that are being used. The arrows going between the different boxes are pretty similar to the arrows that were on the other modular chart. So from the economy, we've got the demand. The economy, we've got the policies going in, so subsidies, taxes, things designed to favour certain technologies. From the energy system, we've got electricity demand. Hopefully that should be fairly obvious. From the environment side, things related to emissions, again, taxes or trading schemes. That feeds into this FTT model, which then gives back various things to the rest of the model, to the economy, investment, which these can be big numbers, investment in power sector facilities, but also electricity prices coming from there. To the energy system, the primary fuel demands of the electricity sector, so coal, gas, for example, and then, of course, emissions back to the environment. Now, one of the advantages of this detailed treatment is we get a lot of different possible policies going in. Here's a list of them. A few of them have come up already. Carbon taxes, of course, linking to an economic model, that has to be the case. But also feed-in tariffs and subsidies, so policies designed to favour particular technologies. Straight regulation, like the UK has now promised to end coal generation by 2025. So basically putting in a ceiling of 0 onto that particular technology. More controversially, plant lifetime. So here we're starting to talk about stranded assets, things like that. Power generation stations that are being closed down before the end of their natural lifetime, being reduced to 0 in value. Exogenous capacity being put in, particularly for things like hydro, also potentially nuclear, where these aren't really determined by prices as such. It's just the government decides we're going to build this, so it gets put in. And then the last one, energy efficiency and reduction in electricity demand. So quite a wide range of possibilities there. Okay, now we skip to University of Cambridge. So question, why look into technology diffusion? Well, the question that's sometimes put to me is, you running a macroeconometric model, why are you not using econometrics to look at the electricity sector? And I say, okay, well, there's two main reasons for this. First of all, we're looking at new technologies. So wind and solar, relatively new themselves, but also things that are further out there. We don't have historical data with which to estimate econometric equation, so it's not going to work. But secondly, the characteristics of the electricity sector, we've got our time series, but we've got big jumps when new power stations get built, because we've got a small number of large installations rather than a large number of small installations. So the jumps in the data make the econometric estimation rather unreliable. So even if we did have historical data, we'd probably be struggling a bit to get stable parameters. So the econometrics doesn't work. We need to come up with something different, and this is basically where we're going with this. It's as consistent in design and assumptions as possible without being an econometric model. So it's still a simulation-based approach. It doesn't assume perfect knowledge or fully rational behavior. It's a more micro investor-driven approach of the main model. And And then this is Jean-Francois' slide that says, okay, technology diffusion, how does this fit into the framework? Why do we need to look at it? And what this slide is showing is a set of model projections of the shares of, I think is it renewables within the overall power mix, and that's the smaller dots that you see on the screen as the model projections. The bigger black dots are what happened in reality afterwards, and the line is the line of best fit going through those. And you can see fairly clearly that the models these are optimization models, they've consistently underestimated the rate of take-up of renewables, and the IEA, International Energy Agency, is among the worst at this with its extremely conservative approach. So the question is, why do the models fail to see the rate of take-up? And what he hit on was the models are generally using a linear optimization approach, whereas if you go to innovation theory, it's all based on non-linear approaches, and in particular these two types of curves. So what do we have here? These are the curves that underpin the model. We've got this S-shaped diffusion curve for the take-up of new technology. So this could apply to any technology, it doesn't have to be energy, but imagine just iPhones. We've got, starting from 0, got a very slow rate of uptake at the beginning. When the iPhone was first launched, it was expensive. Nobody really knew what you could do with it. And the only people that bought it were those people that buy every Apple product that comes out. But gradually, as they bought it, the App Store opened, more apps became available because there were more people using iPhones, and gradually it started to pick up. And then we hit that peak period when the rate of take-up was very quick. Apple was making huge profits from selling large numbers of iPhones, and of course the competitors were coming in as well. And then you got to the top, the number of people that were going to buy it already have done, so there's not many people left, and the rate of sales slows. It's very standard from innovations theory, nothing particularly new here. That's the left-hand curve. The right-hand curve is pretty similar, quite widely accepted in different modeling approaches. Learning rates, as you build more of the stuff, it becomes cheaper, which could be due to economies of scale, it could be due to finding more efficient ways of producing the stuff. But it's a log-shaped distribution coming downwards. The next two slides give some empirical backing to that. So this is a paper from 1978, very well known in that strand of literature, showing the share of each fuel type in primary energy consumption around the world going back to 1860, so a very long time series. And you start off in, the curves are the lines of best fit, and the jagged lines are the actual data. You can see that in 1860 you start off with biomass, wood, traditional means of fuel for heating. But at that time, coal was beginning to take off and be used as a primary fuel. And you see coal peaked around the time of First World War, and by then oil was starting to take off. But very soon after oil, natural gas was following as well, partly because they come from the same places, so they were discovered close together. And then the projections stop at mid-1970s, because that was when the paper was published. And you can see they predicted natural gas going up to over 60% of primary fuel consumption, but they thought that nuclear would be the future and would displace all of those. And then even this last line, SOL, FUS, which is solid fusion, which is, well, by 2020, it was meant to have about 5% of the market, but just shows that, once again, we can't predict future technologies. But having said that, what to take from this chart is just how closely the curves have matched the actual data out there. So the S-shaped diffusions, which have been sort of accumulated here with the market shares, really do work quite well as long as you have an advanced enough starting point on those curves. It's only when you start to predict things from the very low point that they can start to go badly wrong. Incidentally, that's I haven't reproduced all of the slides, but there's a bigger presentation this comes from that has talks about communications technologies with telegraphs, fixed line telephones, and mobile phones, which shows exactly the same pattern, and even one for cars replacing horses, showing a very rapid sort of S-shaped divergence between them. It's consistent. Ah, really? Ah, I don't need to talk about that then. So that was the diffusion. This is the learning rates for the electricity sector here. Across, we've got 3 different technologies: photovoltaics, so solar panels at the top, windmills in the middle, and gas turbines at the bottom. This is on a log scale. Yeah, it would be curves if it was an actual scale. And again, we got the data points for each technology with the lines of best fit going through them, showing consistently, even at early stages, quite consistent slopes on the curves. And you can see for gas turbines, once they become very well established and commercialized, the line flattens somewhat. So there is a question about when the renewable technologies will reach that point. But one thing that's very clear is that the costs do come down over time. Okay, so that's what goes into the model. What is the model then doing? It's all about technology choices. Each technology has a cost associated with it. This is just a levelized cost that's determined by capital, fuel, operations and maintenance cost. That's all very standard. There's also a distribution of investors who have different preferences. So you're a bit like discrete choice modeling for those of you that are familiar with that. And what happens is, imagine this is a curve for 2 different technologies. The costs are changing over time. The curves come together, and you get a probability of moving from one technology to another. Now, it's quite a slow process because the plants last for, say, 30 years, so they don't get replaced immediately. But that's essentially what's happening. And then this probability matrix, Fij, is telling how easy it is to go from one technology to another. So coal to gas is quite easy, but coal to wind, you've got to build a lot of infrastructure and grid stability, so that's more difficult to do. So there's a controlling mechanism in there about how easily you can change between different methods, and that's been matched to the historical data as much as we have it. Okay, I think this is the only equations that I'm showing today, and I'm not going to go through it right now. There is a lot more detail in certainly the paper, even the manual that you have has a bit of an overview of it. But essentially what it's saying is we've got these substitutions between technologies. They become relevant, when you need to build new stuff because demand for electricity increases, you need more plants. Investors are going to, by default, stick with the technologies they know, but if there is a good reason for them to shift, then they will start to do so. But it will be through a diffusion process which is being derived from these equations. The second reason is when plants reach the end of their lifetime and they need to be replaced. What do you build? Again, the default option will be to stick with what you know, but there is a distribution of possible outcomes through all the different technologies that are shifting. And of course, costs come into this, but they're not the only factor by any means. So if you want to see all the equations that lead up to these steps, the paper is there. I think it's open access, but if it's not, then I can send it to you, no problem at all. And for people that are not interested in the equations, what does it all mean in reality for the policy people? Yeah, the avalanches. So Jean-Francois, he comes from Canada originally, so avalanches are quite important there. So he uses this as a metaphor for what can happen inside the modeling framework. It's very much based on positive feedback loops, and path dependence comes out of that. So the bit in the middle with the arrows, that's relating to the two curves for new technologies. So imagine, we'll take solar as an example because this has been happening very clearly. Cost reductions in solar that were originally driven by Germany investing quite a lot in it, which reduced the cost for everybody. The cost came down, so faster diffusion. We started to move up that curve and get to the steep bit of the curve when things happen really quickly. So more and more solar being taken up through the diffusion process. And then, of course, more solar being taken up, further reductions in costs moving down that logarithmic shaped curve, which, again, gets you back to faster diffusion. And we just go around this loop with a positive feedback mechanism for that technology. And that was for solar. We could just as easily have done it for, say, gas or something more established. But I hope that gives a good intuition of how sort of early policy can be important here, because you set that path in motion, you get to a very different outcome than if you do something differently. Okay, are we at lunch? We're at lunch. I don't want to keep people from lunch. It's actually a very good point to break anyway, because there are a few more slides here, but it's an applied example that we're looking at, and that will lead into the practical session for the afternoon. So I think that's quite a good place to stop. Yeah, but the previous one. Oh, the one with equations. Okay. Yeah, I suggest to look at the paper. Because this isn't my work, it's once we get into the details, even I'm struggling to explain all of it. This is an example about energy efficiency in India. I have a few more global examples as well, but I think we might skip over those right now to get onto the more practical elements of the work, so we can always come back to them tomorrow if we want to. Okay, so the first example of using the E3-India model, this is some work that was not done by me, but by a colleague here in India, looking at energy efficiency and particularly LED light bulbs and the potential impact of a large-scale program for rolling out these light bulbs. We started with this diagram, which I think is taken from the model manual. It should be in there somewhere, that shows all the linkages in the model around energy efficiency. So at the top right, you can see the link from efficiency to energy and emissions, but then coming through the economic system down here, and of course ultimately getting to employment, the one bit that the policymakers care about more than anything else. But when we're running these scenarios, it's still useful to have this in mind, because when it comes to checking the results, we can look through each stage to see exactly what's happening and how the elasticities in the model are working through the system. So what do we have? This is the inputs to the scenario. These pictures are just taken from the model interface. So what we're talking about here is it's a scenario where there's a purchase of a large number of LEDs. And you can see it's partly over a historical period starting in 2015 and going up to 2019, I think. And the two things that we put into the model are, on the left-hand side, this variable CRX, which is household consumption of a particular category, in this case the one for household electronics, light bulbs. That's measured in millions of rupees, so we've got 7,000, so 7 billion increase for a 5-year period. And then we've got the reduced energy consumption that results from that, so FREH, model variable for exogenous change in electricity consumption. Of course, that's negative because energy consumption is being reduced. It's minus 4,000, and it's in million tons of oil equivalent, so 4 billion tons of oil equivalent energy savings. You could convert that to gigawatt hours or something if you prefer easy translation. So quite a simple scenario, just those two inputs being put in to represent the purchases of all the light bulbs. The rest of the slides are model outputs, the results from the analysis. And these are all, I'm not sure if they're from the interface, but I think they've just been exported to Excel and turned into charts. So first of all, what happens, again, just thinking back to that diagram, energy savings, so what's the reduction in electricity consumption, first of all. These two charts are showing the same thing. We've got levels on the left-hand side and the difference from the base case with the standard light bulbs on the right-hand side. So the red dotted line is showing the scenario case, so reduction in energy consumption and difference here. Now, reduction shouldn't be surprising because that was the input, was a reduction in electricity consumption of about 4 million tons of oil equivalent. You can see here what comes out of the model at the other end. We have a reduction again, but it's not so big, a bit under 3.5 million. Now the reason for that is basically rebound effects that are often associated with energy efficiency. So lighting becomes cheaper, people use more of it. They may, of course, forget to turn off the lights, all of that, like my wife does very regularly. What's happened is you lose this bit here. So it's a rebound effect of about 15 to 20% overall. And that's just in the household electricity bit, because households, of course, may increase their spending on other stuff that uses electricity as well. So this is not the whole rebound effect, but it's part of it. Having said that, it's still a big reduction in electricity consumption. And of course, that affects the power generation sector, which we see reductions in throughout. So, two charts here. On the left-hand side, this is the change in power generation. Now, it's pretty much a one-to-one change. If electricity consumption falls, electricity generation falls. And that's what we're seeing here. It's in gigawatt hours. The dark green line is the total reduction in electricity generation, and then the red line is from coal. Blue and purple are gas, CCGT, and hydro plants, and all the other technologies are much smaller at the top. So that's going through the power sector model to work out how the generation mix is changing. Now, moving to the right-hand side, we're starting to get towards the economics here, because we're talking about the construction of new electricity plants and the money that's spent doing that. So less electricity generation, less plants to produce that electricity. And that in turn means less investment overall. And what this chart is showing is the reduction in investment. It's in capacity gigawatts, but quite clearly over that 5-year period, a reasonably substantial reduction in the spending on new electricity plants. Taking these two things a bit further. So, yeah. Yep.
This increase in model, how like in 1 year the increase is suddenly, the increase in the capacity new construction. You're saying this is modeled as a one-time increase?
So this is all compared to the base case. So what's going on in the baseline is 0, the dotted line at the top. So it's saying over this 5-year period, a lot less stuff is built, but then once you go back towards the base trend assumptions after the 5-year period, it's more in line with the baseline.
Your consumption never went back to the original level.
Yeah, it never goes back to the original level, but the growth rate returns, that's right. Moving on, we've got CO2 on the left-hand side, so environmental emissions. It's up here, 1,000 tons of carbon, total difference, again, split by fuel type. The dark green line is the total, the red line is from coal, and the light green line is from gas. So overall, a modest reduction in emissions just from less electricity being generated.
Does the reduction in consumption increases the price of electricity?
It probably reduces it. Well, it depends on the mix, the fuel mix going on and how that changes. There's no direct reason for an increase or a decrease. Well, I haven't pulled out electricity price results here, but I don't think they changed by much.
The world over, Germany and so many reports have come with, because the government push on renewable, a lot of thermals and others are becoming unviable. And that's creating a problem in many countries.
Yeah, this is a really good question about how electricity prices are formed in the model. We've had lots of debates about this, how it should be modeled, because obviously we have the current marginal price setting. But we don't think it's going to last into the future for exactly the reasons that you're saying, that the missing money problem, companies going bankrupt. So we are taking a long run view on the price and just saying it's an average cost of generation rather than a marginal cost. So the electricity price is determined by just a weighted average of the different technologies used. So here, because it's ambiguous how the shares change, I'm sure the electricity price does change, but whether it's up or down just depends on the shares. Whereas if it was a marginal cost basis, then it would, I think, probably come down. But yeah, and this, more generally, if this is something you want to look into, there are alternative options available in the modelling for how to do this. But the default assumption is an average cost. Okay, and then on the right-hand side, we've got employment. It starts to get a bit more complicated here. So what do we see here? This is employment in thousands of jobs split by sector, and by no means are all the sectors on here. We have, the easier one is the dark blue line, which is the easiest one to see in front of all the others, that's the electricity sector itself. So very basic relationship, less electricity being generated, less people working in the power sector, fine. The other lines, the red one, the purple one, and the green one, manufacturing, trade, and construction, these all relate to the investment. So they have big dips in the 5-year period because that's when fewer plants are being built. So there's less demand for construction and associated activities, less jobs in those sectors. They bounce back after the 5-year period. In fact, they bounce back over some, and you can see some cyclical stuff in there, which comes back to the econometric equations and the lagged effects that are in there, and the labour market typically lagging what's happening in the wider economy. They look quite big, those changes, but when you convert it back to levels, and the lines are on top of each other, you barely see anything there. And that's probably what you would expect, because we're talking about light bulbs here, then it's not going to change the direction of the economy. The other line, public admin, the orange line, there is a small increase over the 5-year period. That's basically administration for the scheme, so some jobs being created to make sure that the light bulbs are being bought and installed as they should be. But otherwise, that's held as exogenous and doesn't change from the baseline. And what we don't have on here is all the services, the other services sectors, which of course many of them are far, far bigger in absolute terms, and not much is happening there. So all of these changes need to be taken in the context of the other bigger sectors as well. And the last slide on this, all the previous results were at national level for India. Of course, we've got the states underpinning this. We've not tried to put all 32 labels onto here, but the states are all there. You can see there is a spread of results in, I think, all 4 of the charts, and occasionally one state that is falling below the other ones. This, so it says on the slide title, initial state level impacts. We haven't looked into all the details as to why this is happening, but in general, it's employment in the electricity sector. Well, that probably depends on the generation mix that's in each sector and how labour intensive it is. Usually more people are working with renewables plants than conventional ones, just because of the maintenance part of it. So if you're more weighted in that direction, there's more jobs at stake. It's a relationship like that, and also various levels of efficiency across the states. But it's a reasonably wide range, so showing that it's quite important to look at the different impacts at state level, and particularly when we get to GDP. Some states are producing coal, some states are much more suitable for renewables, so there are distributional impacts here and quite a lot of the scenarios that we expect the model will be used to look at. So yeah, food for thought on there again, with the aim of stimulating ideas for the practical exercise. Any questions on that scenario?
Promoting efficiency, bringing down the GDP.
Sorry?
Promoting efficiency is bringing down the GDP.
It's having a slight negative impact on GDP in most states here. It relates to the detailed modelling assumptions here, and that I think what's been put into the model is that okay, there's a spending on the light bulbs, but then there's a reduction in expenditure on energy, and what hasn't been entered is what that money could be spent on otherwise. If you put that in, then you would start to see positive results, I expect, and also bigger rebound effects on the energy side as well. So this is again, it's a question about scenario specification, which does matter.
Why does it make that? I still don't understand. Why does it, I mean, put in the other things,
Mm.
why does the reduction in energy use bring down the GDP?
Yeah.
Like sale of electricity.
Mm. Investment, yeah, investment is, in the 5-year period, a lot of it's driven by investment, that's right. Beyond the 5-year period, I think it's to do with the household balances, and that the money that would have been spent on electricity would count towards GDP, whereas instead it's being saved, which does not. There are different short-term and long-term effects happening here. In the short term, there's a reduction in aggregate demand in the economy, which is pushing things down. But I think you're right that in the longer term, higher efficiency would be boosting growth. I suspect if we run this out longer, things would start to come above the line.
So there are two questions. One was that does the manufacturing of the energy, is that taken into account?
Mm-hmm.
And the other is that how is the economic investment of non-power sector? Is that not function of the electricity?
Mm-hmm.
Electricity is cheaper than
Yep. The first one, the manufacturing of the LEDs, yes, it is taken into account, but a reasonably large proportion of it is imports, so it's not counting towards Indian GDP. It's other countries that benefit. And the other investment, yes, there's endogenous investment equations for all sectors, which will. The function of those equations is investment is a function of expected demand in the future, so they move in line with output. So maybe for those sectors producing LEDs, there would be an increase in investment because they see higher output. But otherwise, there's not that much change overall.
The expected demand is a function of price, which is a function of energy cost.
So which sectors? I mean,
I'm asking, for some of the sector will that will do that because there is cheaper energy, therefore the more demand of invest more and produce more.
yeah, there could be some effects like that. Yeah, yeah. But, yeah, it's. Yeah, there are a lot more slides about this available. Yeah. Well, I mean, we can make all the slides available, but we probably need to move on at this point, is it? Okay, any more questions on this before we start to get towards the practical stuff? Yeah, this is quite a generic diagram. So energy efficiency, we don't have a representation of all the detailed energy efficiency potentials in the model. That's asking too much. So there's no variable for LED light bulbs in the model. It's a top-down economic model. So when we look at energy efficiency, we need to know before we do any modeling what are the energy savings and how much is it going to cost. Now, the LED light bulbs was quite a good example of that because it's not too difficult to calculate what the energy savings are. It's just a function of amount of energy consumed per light bulb times the amount it's switched on times the number of light bulbs that are out there. Do that multiplication, you can get to an annual energy savings to plug in. The cost of all of it is fairly easily available as well, cost per light bulb times the number of light bulbs. So that gives us the two inputs. Now, how do they go into the model? That is basically the next slide on these two things. So that's the cost there. So cost of each light bulb times the light bulbs, and then the energy savings bit here. So these two things are the interventions that we're making in the model. And generally, for any regulation that we're looking at, that's the sort of thing we have to think about before we get to the modeling. Once that goes into the model, then it does the rest. But we do need to do that initial calculation. Okay, introduction to the interface. There's not too many slides here. It's really just to aiming to get everybody started, and then we can switch to the more hands-on element of the afternoon session. Right, first of all, I'm just going to talk about the file structure, really just so you have a basic idea of what's going on behind the scenes. And if you're interested in looking at any of these further, you can dig into it, but you don't really need to go in that much detail. Then start to look at the software, so yeah, options to run the model, but editing, inputs, what happens when you run it, and how to look at the outputs. That's the three main bits, basically. Again, questions, feel free to jump in. I don't know how many of you have opened the software already. I suspect some of you may well be playing with it already, but here's the introduction for all of you. Okay, so this is the basic file structure. You won't see something like this in the interface because it's gathering all the information together for you. But it's worth bearing in mind anyway that this is the basic modeling process. So we've got the model in the middle with the red circle that looks like a stop sign. It wasn't meant to look like a stop sign. And you've got 5 things feeding into it there, which are the things you need for our model run. Where to start on this? The first thing you need is the data banks. That's all provided already. That's the historical data. It's the econometric estimates of the parameters. It sits there in the background. You really need to be aware of it. Then to the left of that, we've got 3 things. History file, again, is something that's provided that you don't need to pay too much attention to. It basically runs the model over the historical period, calculates lags, other things that are needed for the econometric equations, and basically sets the model up to use. Then it gets interesting after that. Scenario input file and assumption file, these are the things that the users work with and interact. The assumptions file is the more basic one. It includes things that you need in every model run, like assumptions about demographics, population growth, tax rates, and an assumption about what's going on in the rest of the world. The model won't run without these things. Of course, there's a base case included, so you don't need to build it up from scratch, but these assumptions do need to get in there somehow. Then the scenario file, as the name suggests, that's more related to policy inputs. So here, things like carbon taxes, energy taxes, trading schemes, that's where all of these things get entered. So very much policy focused, things that we'd want to look at in scenarios. And then the other one that in the top right, the solution script, this is where we can put in a lot more stuff. So the scenario file gives us some of the easy policies, but also the most common ones, carbon taxes, for example. It's all basically point and click, type in the odd number here and there. It's designed to be as easy to use as possible. The solution script, again, it's all provided, but this is where there's the options to come up with much more complicated scenarios. Now, this does require a sort of quasi-programming knowledge to do, so it's for the more advanced users. But I expect some of you probably will get to this. Some of you, at least, will get to this. But we're trying to come up with a compromise between having something that's easy to use for the most common policies, but then also providing the flexibility to look at other options as well. Okay, so when we look at the interface, you'll see when we try to run the model, it's going to ask you, what do you want to use, which solution script, which scenario file, which assumption file. You'll see the drop-down menus asking what we want to use. Okay, then you run the model. Hopefully it all works and there's no software glitches and everything is fine. What happens is it records all the results, again, to this orange box dump title. And it's called dump because it's literally the model is just dumping all the numbers out into a binary file, which is not really of much use to anybody. But literally all the information from the model is being put into that file. And then there's a second stage of interaction, which is called a DAN file, just means data analysis, nothing complicated, which is choosing which outputs we want to look at and extract, and then that feeds into the output, which then goes back to the interface, and all the charts that we've seen already are coming from that process. Now, again, what's been provided in the DAN file should give you most of what you need, but if there's anything missing, it's quite straightforward to add more model variables to that. I think I'll skip over this one, but it will be in the slides if you need to come back to it. It's basically what I've just spoken about. Okay, options to run the model. I wasn't going to show this originally, but actually some questions have come up about it in the past week. What we're going to be doing in the sessions today and tomorrow is the option number 1, the front end. This is certainly the introductory one. It will do most of what you want to do, and probably all that we want to do today and tomorrow, although never cease to be amazed by what people ask and the model can do. It says basic users, but it's really all levels of users. When I'm working with the model, I use it as well, certainly for looking at outputs, certainly for very specific things. I will go to the other options. Okay, it works on Windows. I was nervously looking around the room to see how many Apple computers were here. Sorry, we haven't got it working with Mac OS yet, but we hope to have it at some point in the future. But it will be fine on all of your laptops, no problem at all. What you can do in the interface, set up the model, run the model, look at the results, that's all fine. And then the last point, if you want to do further data analysis of results, export it all to Excel, and then you've got all the usual functions in Excel to do whatever you want with the outputs, no problem there. Just quickly on the other two options, getting to the more basic, so running through the command line, essentially the user interface is sending stuff to the command line, just it's hiding it so that you don't see it. You can do it directly through the command line as well. That's not a problem if you prefer to do it that way. Happy to show you how to do it. And then option 3, which is getting more into the research sphere, to run the model lots and lots of times with varying inputs. If you're familiar with MATLAB or other languages like that, then you can interact to do that, but probably a bit further down the line. Okay, now before we get going on the interface, and so also you have this slide for reference, introduction to it. So this is what you'll see when you first open it, and I suspect some of you have seen already. It's a web browser. It opens in your default web browser. Now, we've tested it most extensively on Google Chrome, but it generally works okay on the other ones. But if you find problems, then we do recommend switching to Google Chrome. You see, well, there'll be, you'll see an icon that opens at the bottom that looks like a sort of DOS command prompt thing. That's just running in the background. You don't need to worry about that. Within the web page, this is the introductory page. Just gives details of all the different things in the model. But the key thing to look at is the tabs across the top, which unfortunately haven't come out on the projection. But there should be a grey bar there with the different tabs. And you can move between these tabs as you would expect on a web page. And this is what each one does. Introduction, data banks is something for the future. But then idiom instructions, scenarios, and assumptions, that comes back to the 3 input files, again, that we were talking about. The variables tab gives a list of some of the codes and that we were looking at. So we talked about, say, FR0 earlier. What does that mean? You should find it somewhere in that list. Then I want to run the model. Oops, I got a bit ahead of the slides. These are just the inputs. To run the model, you will see something like this. Again, we're going to go through this, so don't worry about it too much now. But effectively, you'll get to a page with 3 drop-down menus for the 3 inputs, a box to type the name of the output file into, and then the buttons at the bottom to actually run the model. To get to the results, again, we're going to go through this in a minute, but that's what it looks like. And to chart the results, to keep in mind, because we might get a bit distracted by this point, that to look at the charts, on the left-hand side, you'll see the options to choose the model variable, the state, the sector, and then underneath that, you can choose how the results are charted, either in levels, difference from baseline, or percentage difference from baseline, and all converted into annual growth rates. So do have a look down at those, because we'll probably be talking about other things when we get down to that stage. Okay, so that's it for the slides. Are there any questions?